In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, a good day to you, and thanks for joining us here on another episode of Veracity Hill, where we are striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. It's a pleasure to be with you here from the Defenders Media Seminar here in Wheaton, Illinois. We are at the Reliable event, Can You Trust the Bible? And today I am joined here with Ted Wright. And Ted, you've made an appearance on our show before, although not in person before, so it's great to have you here in the flesh in Chicagoland. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Kurt. Great to be here.
For those of you who are regular listeners, last week, we covered the topic of Lent and what that entailed. We had Father Aaron Damiani to join us, and we talked about sort of the good beneficial experience of observing it, and some Protestants, they're not too keen on it, but there are some good reasons why we should do that. So if you haven't had a chance to listen to that episode yet, please do so. Today we are talking about digging for truth, and whether you're listening to us live on the internet or if you're following us on Facebook, which we've got going here today at the event, we would love to take your questions. There are a couple ways that we're doing that today, though, however. We normally have our phone system, as you might know, and you can call that number at any time and leave us a message, or even during the show. The number is 505-2-STRIVE. That's 505-278-7483. But today, we're not going to be doing the phone system, so there's only a couple ways that you can comment or get in touch with us. One, if you are watching on Facebook, I'm going to try my best to keep tabs on the Facebook comments here on the stream on my phone. No promises on that. Number two, though, you can text us. So all you need to do is text the word Veracity to 555-888. That's Veracity to the number 555-888. And here on my computer, I'll load up the texting program, and we'll see if you've got any questions for us. And that also goes, that's the same for our live studio audience here. Why don't you guys all shout and say hello to the internet? Hello. All right, that was great. So if you guys do have questions, there might be an opportunity here for you to come up. Maybe you could even stand in line. Or if you just want to be anonymous and you want to text them in, you can do that as well. I'll load up the system, assuming that our internet connection keeps going well, as it is. So that's great. Good. Okay, so today's episode is called Digging for Truth, and we're talking about archaeology. We're here at an apologetics conference. And, the podcast covers apologetics in addition to other issues. And Defenders Media is an apologetic nonprofit ministry. So, Ted, could you tell us a little bit about how it is that archaeology and apologetics are related, and what is that role that archaeology plays in apologetics?
That's a great question, Kurt. Thank you. And again, thanks for joining us. Those of you who are online or watching through the podcast, and those of you here, thank you guys for being here as well. And that's a great question. The relationship between archaeology and apologetics. Earlier today, I was giving a talk and mentioned to the audience here, and it's worth repeating that archaeology is really part of a greater case for Christianity. And as many of you know, I used to work for Cross-Examined, and we have 4 questions that we teach there that are what we call I call them the 4 fundamental questions, or 4 vital questions of apologetics. And so they're really 5, I would say, but let's just start with 4. And so just show you how archaeology fits into that. The number 1 is, does truth exist? Is there such a thing as absolute truth? And then number 2, does God exist? Very fundamental question. You begin with truth, because if there is no truth, then not even atheism can be true. And then God has to exist. There has to be a theistic God. I mean, we're operating on the assumption that God exists, okay? That's part of the overall case for Christianity. So, does truth exist? Does God exist? Number 3, are miracles possible? Are miracles possible? I mean, if there is a God, then miracles are possible. But there are those today who are in the scientific community mainly, who believe that miracles are not possible, that the natural world is all that we have. So theism gets you miracles. And number 4 would be, is the New Testament reliable? Is the New Testament reliable? Do we have accurate historical information from the New Testament? Because the essence and the core of the Christian faith is the resurrection, as you know, Kurt. The resurrection. If the resurrection had not happened, if Jesus had not historically risen from the dead, then as Paul says, we're still dead in our sins and transgressions, and we are to be pitied among all men. So Christianity is unique in that it is a religion that is grounded in history. And history, because the resurrection is an event that happened 2,000 years ago, we have a book, the Bible, that actually teaches us about the resurrection. So then history becomes very important. And the fourth question is the New Testament historically reliable? Then becomes an important apologetic question. And then from that, I would say the fifth question, which we would add on, did Jesus rise from the dead? But you've got to have those four questions. So where does archaeology fit into those four questions? Number one, does truth exist? Does God exist? Are miracles possible? And is the New Testament reliable? Well, archaeology is part of that fourth question. Is the New Testament historically reliable? So there are two ways in which we establish the historical reliability of the New Testament. Number one is through manuscript evidence. And we've got literally over 6,000 manuscripts now of the New Testament. Many of them have been found recently in the past decade or so. There's an organization now that's led by a gentleman that I've met on several occasions and been to some conferences with him, Dr. Daniel Wallace at Dallas Theological Seminary. It's called the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts at Dallas Seminary. And many Christians are maybe not aware of what he does. Pretty amazing, actually. What he does is there are still monasteries and libraries around the world that contain manuscripts, and many of these manuscripts are biblical manuscripts that they're unaware of. So what Dr. Wallace is doing is he's going around the world in these libraries, and he's actually digitally photographing manuscripts that have not yet been counted as part of the overall manuscript for the New Testament.
So before they basically go off into the dust of the earth,
yes,
we can digitize what they look like,
yes,
put them up on the internet forever.
And you can go to his website. I think you can Google it. It says Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts. And you can actually look at these manuscripts on your computer. They are rare Greek manuscripts. Of course, we've got the Chester Beatty Papyrus, and we've got some other things. And there's sort of this mysterious Mark fragment that don't even ask me about that. Please, no one ask about the Mark fragment. Excuse me, insider joke here. In any case, there is a purported fragment of Mark's gospel that dates to the time of the eyewitnesses. But in any case, we know that internally, just based on the New Testament itself, internally within the text, we know that the New Testament was written very early because we believe that Mark was written first, very likely, because it contains very early source material, creeds, and things like that. And then Paul's writings were written at least before 70 A.D. Why? Because all of Paul's letters, none of them mention the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, a major event. We know historically that happened in 70 A.D. So we know that all of these manuscripts and all of these writings date to a very early time frame, which means that they would have dated within the time period of the eyewitnesses. So that's one aspect, Kurt. And the other aspect, so we've got the manuscript evidence, and then we have the archaeological evidence. And this morning, we've been talking about primary sources. And the first session we had this morning was the Bible and history. And here in the audience, I'll let you guys put you on the spot so you can impress everybody with your knowledge. What are the three primary sources of history? Eyewitnesses, historical records, and archaeological data. That's right, or archaeological remains. So there are eyewitnesses, historical records, and archaeological remains. And the Gospels claim to be written by eyewitnesses. They claim to be written by people who, as John says, we have beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. We saw him with our eyes. We put our hands on his. We put our hands in his hands. We felt his wounds. We saw him. It was claimed to have been written by eyewitnesses, and many of Paul's letters, in fact, the Gospels, they talk about people. They talk about places. They talk about events that happened, and in fact. And I think I've got this correct, and double check me if I don't think I'm wrong on this though, but I think that every major New Testament city that's been mentioned in the New Testament has been discovered archaeologically. Every single one. Not one city that's mentioned in the New Testament has not been found archaeologically. So cities, people, places, Pontius Pilate. Later on, we're going to talk about, later today we'll talk about this, but we actually have found, not me, but us, collectively, archaeologists, scholars, have found the ossuary, the coffin, the bone box of Caiaphas, the high priest that presided over the trial of Christ. Not only that, his bones are in there.
Huh.
The bones of Caiaphas, the high priest that presided. We say, well, Ted, how do you know that? I mean, yeah, you just found some bones. Yeah, here's Caiaphas, the high priest. Well, it was found in a section in Jerusalem that was known to be a very wealthy burial spot for the very wealthy people in Jerusalem in the first century. And it was contained in the most elaborate coffin ever found there at the site. And it has a name inscribed on the side of the coffin, Joseph ben Caiaphas. We say, well, how do you know it's that? Well, the historian Josephus mentions the full name of Caiaphas, Joseph ben Caiaphas, the high priest in Jerusalem that presided at the trial of Christ.
Wow, nice.
So we have the bones of the high priest that presided at the trial of Christ.
Yep.
We have also found evidence of Pontius Pilate's existence outside the Bible. Dozens and dozens of others, all the major, in fact, in my bag that I forgot, I usually keep it in my pocket, I actually have a coin from King Herod Agrippa I, who was the son of Herod the Great. I also have a coin from Herod the Great. We know about Herod. Nobody doubts his existence. Nobody doubts that Herod existed. So
there is this robust data, the archaeological record, that helps to confirm what the Bible is telling us.
Yes, absolutely.
And now, it seems, at least from my surveying of the archaeological data, that a lot of this is just coming forth in the past, say, 50 or maybe even 100 years.
Yes.
So for the vast majority of the Christian tradition, this data has not been available to people.
That's true. Yeah, Kurt, and there was several years ago, and I got the honor. He's sort of my hero, and I didn't even know it. But when we were in San Diego a couple of years ago, I think you were there at that meeting. We were there listening to a lecture, and I had first read about him, and he was footnoted in the books I was reading. And then I actually saw his books, and he's a Japanese-American archaeologist by the name of Edwin Yamauchi. Dr. Yamauchi is at Oxford, Miami University at Oxford, Ohio. And I never could figure that out. Miami University, Oxford, Ohio. Okay, never mind. Anyway, so I was at this lecture, and I'm at this lecture, and sitting beside me is Dr. Edwin Yamauchi. I looked at his name tag. I was like, there's my hero, Dr. Yamauchi. So he was very kind to me, and told him a little bit about what I was doing, and telling him apologetics and archaeology. And he actually sent me some really amazing articles that he wrote on archaeology, and just an honor to meet me and wanted to follow me and see what I'm doing and everything. He's an elderly gentleman now. I think he's in probably his 70s or 80s. But anyway, just great to meet him. But Dr. Yamauchi, to answer your question, I call these, in fact, when I lecture and I give a class on this, I call these Yamauchi's fractions. Only a fraction of the sites remain. Only a fraction of those sites have been excavated. And only a fraction of that stuff is published. So we are just now scratching the surface. Even though archaeology has been around for about 100 years, we are just now really getting in. There's more stuff coming out. So people who are skeptical of the Bible, New Testament or Old Testament,
just they wait.
Exactly. I mean, it's just like, what we've found already. And I'll give you an example that Dr. Bryant Wood with Associates for Biblical Research, who I'm associated with him as well, ABR. Just shout out to the ABR folks who are out there. But Dr. Wood has a great little thing that he gives about archaeology in the Bible. And he said, obviously we can't find every single thing. Like when you look at the Bible from Genesis to Revelation, we haven't found every single thing. Archaeology hasn't found every page of the Bible is improved by archaeology. But he said it's sort of like a factory. You go to a factory that makes widgets, and there's a quality control point. And you're making millions of widgets a day, like let's say 10,000 widgets a day, and every so often you pull a widget off of the conveyor belt, and you want to make sure the quality is right. So every time you take a sampling, you want to make sure that that's right. That's the way archaeology has been. Every time we dip into the ground and take a sample, Bible's historically accurate. Bible's historically accurate. Bible's historically accurate. So we haven't found everything, but whenever we've taken a sample, whenever we've looked at things in the archaeological record, then it has come out to be very reliable.
It's almost counterintuitive. People think the further that we get away, the less we can know.
Right.
But yet here we are growing in this field of study.
And I will add that further, that a lot of the things that have been discovered were not really found by people looking for it. They were found accidentally. They were not, like the Pontius Pilate inscription was found in Caesarea in 1961, and it was found by, I believe it was Italian archaeologists excavating the amphitheater at Caesarea. And they were not looking to prove the Bible. They just found this inscription that contained the name of Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. Isn't that interesting? So, there's a lot of sites like that.
Before I ask my next question, let me open up my Dr. Pepper here, which many longtime listeners know is my favorite
He says that's
beverage.
Dr. Pepper. Yeah. We all know.
There's one segment of a show that we've presently taken a break of called Rapid Questions. And one of the and it's when I ask these questions to the guest, and one of the questions is if they drink Dr. Pepper. So usually I'm pleased or disappointed. And when I'm disappointed in their answer, then I ask a follow-up. It's, would you consider drinking a Dr. Pepper if you were given one? And so to those that really turn it down, they lose some points in my book. All right, so Ted, tell us, what is the state of biblical archaeology today? Do most scholars in secular schools recognize the value that this brings to even when we talk about the Bible, archaeology and the Bible?
That's a great question, Kurt. And so what is the state of biblical archaeology today? Well, let me start by saying this. I want to say maybe 15, 20 years ago, there's a professional organization called ASOR. It stands for the American Schools of Oriental Research. And there are two great prestigious organizations in America, academic organizations that study archaeology. One is here in Chicago, in your lovely town of Chicago, the Oriental Institute, which I was there yesterday. It was amazing. The Oriental Institute, the University of Chicago, and then ASOR stands for the American Schools of Oriental Research, and that was co-founded by George Ernest Wright and William F. Albright.
Any relation?
I don't know, maybe, possibly. But anyway, ASOR, their goal, or their journal, their professional journal, was called Biblical Archaeologist. And so their purpose was to look at archaeology as it relates to the Bible. Well, they did a survey of their members several years ago. In fact, I was a student member at the time, of ASOR student member, and I got the journal. It's called Biblical Archaeologist on the top cover. And these are professional, very academic articles, not quite for laymen, but pretty professional stuff, journal quality. And they put a survey out, should we change the name of Near Eastern Archaeologist to Near Eastern Archaeologist, to get away from the name Biblical Archaeologist, and get away from this idea of biblical archaeology. And interestingly, I think 70 to 80% of the readers, and many of them were scholars, and many of them were not quite conservative scholars.
Did they say no?
No, they said don't change the name.
Yeah, awesome.
And you know what they did? Change the name. They changed the name. I voted. In fact, they actually published my little thing as a student.
Yeah, nice.
Theodore Wright from, who knows from where I was living at the time. Anyway, they published my little thing, and they're saying no. I mean, the founders, when they started the journal, they wanted to specifically focus on archaeology in the Bible. Yeah. So there's been a move away from the term. In fact, now it's a sort of a pejorative term among scholars. Anybody who's doing archaeology today, whether it's at UC San Diego or Chicago or Johns Hopkins or wherever, there's a lot of great schools doing archaeology. University of Pennsylvania does some great stuff. They sort of shy away from the term biblical archaeology. But I will say this, all of this caveat: there is a new growing movement among conservative archaeologists and those of us who believe the Bible is inerrant. We believe in inerrancy. That there's been some amazing new discoveries, and some of this work has been done by Dr. Bryant Wood and others who basically are saying that the Bible does contain a lot of great historical truth to it, and now people are beginning to take notice. Those of us who call ourselves biblical archaeologists or Near Eastern archaeologists, whatever, sure. That the Bible does contain a lot of great historical detail. And so now the pieces of the puzzle are starting to come together. So I personally think that even though today the current state of academia and archaeology is that you can't really trust the Bible, I think there's sort of there's an interest in that. And
it's a historical document, and it's not that they have to believe exactly what it says, say, on theological matters,
right,
there still is history behind it, and that can and should be explored.
Right, and to go back and to kind of, it's a huge subject. The question's a great question, but so there's and earlier we talked about this. There's a movement today among academic archaeologists, and I don't think it's shared by all of them, but there's sort of an internal debate today among Near Eastern archaeologists who wouldn't call themselves biblical archaeologists; they would call themselves Near Eastern archaeologists, or Syro-Palestinian archaeologists. Some people, maybe University of Arizona.
Sure.
But so the debate is what's called biblical minimalism versus biblical maximalism. And one I actually studied under one of his graduate students, James Harden. His name is Dr. William Deaver at the University of Arizona. Now, Dr. Deaver is considered to be a biblical maximalist in the secular realm. But when we say when a secular person uses the term biblical maximalist, what they mean is that they believe the Bible is historically accurate to the time of the Babylonian exile. Anything before the Babylonian exile is not really, we're not quite sure, or it probably didn't happen. Like the conquest, Moses, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob.
JEDP.
Exactly. So even though they're
yeah.
maximalists, they're not quite as maximal as we are, because we believe the Exodus actually happened, and we believe the patriarchs really did exist, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And now we've got evidence of that. Some new stuff coming out.
Which you described this morning, which is awesome.
Yeah, it was pretty amazing stuff. And so anyway, the minimalists are coming from Copenhagen and postmodernism. The Copenhagen House or School of Biblical Interpretation house. And they basically say that the Bible cannot be trusted with anything historical, that it's just myth, made up, invented. And so those are the ones that are sort of, they're biblical minimalists. They see no historical value at all. So that's kind of where some people fall into in the academic realm. You're either a maximalist, but just to say you're a maximalist doesn't mean that you're an inerrantist. It just means that you believe that, they probably went into Babylonian exile, but anything before that, the Exodus. So a real maximalist would be the one who Genesis, Revelation.
Yeah. It seems that from the secular side of things, they're weary of people's motivations. So if someone is motivated by the Bible to discover archaeology, well, we should shy away from that. But, I mean, even in logic, that's sort of like the genetic fallacy, right? If you could cite where an idea comes from, the idea therefore must be false, which, of course, is absurd because we can cite the origin of true propositions and true beliefs we have. In the same way, I mean, it's all about the evidence. What does the archaeological data tell us? So even if someone has biblical motives, shall we say, it's still either a good artifact or a bad one, right?
Exactly.
So why is it? There's got to be some other reasons why the secular audience is weary of
it's interesting, Kurt, because you can see what people really think about archaeology in the Bible by the discoveries that are made that disprove the Bible. They'll go, see, here's an example where archaeology, well, conversely, if it can disprove, then it can also prove. Yeah. I mean, not proof in a logical sense.
Despite their worst nightmares
exactly.
Becoming true.
So they're quick to point out, a couple of years ago, there was a story that came out where they found some camel bones, and they said, well, Abraham has mentioned he had camels, and it's not in the Bible, so it was an anachronism. And so it looked like it appeared to be that archaeology disproved the Bible. As it turns out, it was a little too premature. So that's always been the case. I mean, if you look at the history of biblical archaeology, there have been people who have been critical of the biblical text, and then a later discovery would then disprove that person that they were wrong. And so the Bible has an amazing track record of it being actually very reliable in detail, and again, sometimes accidentally.
So I want to get into some of those things that do sort of perhaps prove it. But first, you sort of mentioned there the disproving. Are there shall we say, these difficulties in the archaeological data that might, present a forced interpretation with how we understand the Bible? Are there what off the top of your head might you think of?
Say it like
what is there out there that people say this disproves the Bible?
Oh, okay. So what
if anything?
If anything, that's a great question. What disproves the Bible? I would say probably the conquest. We talked about this earlier today. We talked about the conquest. We talked about Jericho. And people will look at Jericho and they will see a documentary, or they'll look it up online. And there are some websites that talk about Jericho, but they'll look at Jericho and they'll look at Kathleen Kenyon's interpretation of Jericho.
And say this,
and they'll say
the dates don't line up.
The dates don't line up. And then they'll just keep the clock going back, and they'll go, the Exodus supposedly happened under Ramses II, but there's no plagues, there's no death camp, there's nothing. There's no Ramses. It's sort of like in the movie Indiana Jones. I keep going back to Indiana Jones. I wonder why. But anyway, they go back and they're looking for this place that is called the Well of the Souls. Remember that? And they're in a race against the Nazis, and they find this staff of Ra, and Indian Salak, they rappel down into this cave, into this map room, and they put the thing in a socket, and the sun comes through, and the light gazes down, and it shows you the exact spot where the Ark of the Covenant was, and they look at each other, they're digging in the wrong place. Well, it's sort of like that with a lot of secular archaeologists. They're looking in the wrong time. They put up the evidence they say Exodus and conquest happened in the 1200s BC. Well, there it is, not there. Well, you're looking in the wrong time frame. And again, earlier today we were talking about their chronology. We were talking about the importance of chronology, the importance of time, and how with synchronisms based in the Neo-Assyrian record under Sennacherib in 701 BC, we're able to establish a pretty firm Old Testament chronology. So if we can anchor our time in 701 BC, then we know, based on the internal evidence in the Scripture itself, based in 2 Chronicles and Kings, that 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1 says the Exodus happened 480 years prior to the laying of the foundations of Solomon's temple. So that means, based on that chronology, Solomon would have done that in about 967 BC. You just reverse the clock back, 480 years. That puts the Exodus at about 1446 BC. So now you have some amazing evidence for the Exodus, and you see this with Amenhotep II.
Yeah, and the key then is to line up the internal evidence with the external.
Yes.
And you want to see, it's like a dance almost, because sometimes maybe the external evidence might force us to reevaluate our internal perspective, which I'll be talking a little bit about in terms of the gospel differences later today. But it's kind of that fine dance. You want to see both.
Yes. And it's not a case of where, some people say, I can hear some skeptics say, well, you're just trying to force the Bible to fit the archaeology. And that's not the case at all, because in Egyptian chronology, in Egyptian history, there were 3 intermediate periods. And these are periods of upheaval in which the Egyptians did keep meticulous records of their pharaohs, of their kings. And we learned about this through the writer Manetho, who was a priest. And we learned about Egyptian history and how they kept records. But these intermediate periods of Egyptian history is when we sort of lose track of the time frame. There are 3 intermediate periods. So there's nothing definitive about the dates, and you have to sort of, there's pretty much an accepted chronology, given these intermediate periods, and we're pretty sure we know what the Egyptian chronology is. We know who the pharaohs of the 18th dynasty are. We know that the dates are. So there really doesn't appear to be any dates that need to be adjusted in Egyptian chronology. What we're trying to do now is reconcile Syro-Palestinian archaeology, or the archaeology in Israel, with the archaeology or what we see going on in Egypt, to see if there is correlation. And again, a very important point to make when we're talking about the Exodus and conquest. We often think about the Exodus, the Pharaoh, all that, the chariots and we get all the great stuff. But think of it as it's a one big event archaeologically, at least time frame. Exodus, conquest. If there was an Exodus, there must have been a conquest. If there was a conquest, you'll see it in the archaeological record. And we do, and the two fit together. So based on this chronology we talked about earlier, about the 1446 date, it's called the early date, by the way, not the late date. And some of you may have seen the movie, Patterns of Evidence. It's a movie, a documentary about the Exodus. And it was a very well-produced movie, a documentary. And there's some good things about it. The thing that kind of got me was it was sort of uncertain. I had some of my colleagues in it with ABR. Dr. I don't know if Petrovich was in there. I think he may have been. But I know Dr. Bryant Wood was in there. David Roll was in there as well. And Roll actually argues for adjusting the Egyptian chronology to make it fit. So there's pros and cons to that. But me personally, the issue with adjusting Egyptian chronology is it's sort of like a slide rule. If you adjust it here, it's going to have a domino effect down here. So if we had readjust Egyptian chronology and we put the Exodus in a different pharaoh, then we don't see any Exodus. We see no Exodus at all. And so we have to make all the archaeology and all the pieces of the puzzle fit together. And again, it's not a matter of forcing it. It's a matter of using good scholarship and using archaeology. And I think a case can be made that the early date is grounded in good, solid archaeology.
Great. Well, we've got to take a short break, but we've got some more questions afterwards, so stick with us.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Are you tired of wasting your time and money on ads that just aren't producing? What if there was an easier way to get great advertising results with tons of traffic and social engagement to your brand without wasting your time or money? Well, there is an easier way, and it's called TrafficBuffet.com, a new and easy way to generate the traffic you need through our global network of publishers, all with one click. Explode your site traffic and send tens of thousands of potential customers to your site daily. Build your brand with our social campaigns like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and more. Our dedicated account reps provide amazing support. So don't wait. Get started today. TrafficBuffet.com. Measurable results, driving success.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Join the Illinois Family Institute for a special forum, Climate Change and the Christian, with Dr. Calvin Beisner in Rockford, Arlington Heights, Orland Park, and Peoria.
The Green Movement threatens to trap the poor in poverty and rob people of property rights by touting false or exaggerated claims of eco-disaster.
Dr. Calvin Beisner is the founder of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. You don't want to miss his presentation on climate change and the Christian. What's true, what's not settled science, and what's our responsibility.
Now, it's true that if you love God, you will try to take good care of the earth. And I encourage you to do exactly that. But that's not gospel. That's law.
The Illinois Family Institute Climate Change and the Christian Forum is free, so bring your family and friends. Visit IllinoisFamily.org for times, dates, and locations, or call 708-781-9328.
All right, thanks for sticking with us through that short break from our sponsors. And now is time for a segment, a new segment to the show that we've had for a couple weeks. We've taken a slight sabbatical, shall we say, from Rapid Questions. Plus, Ted, you've already done the Rapid Questions. But the segment of our show here is What Do You Meme? And a meme, for those of you who aren't familiar, is one of those images you might see on social media being floated around. It's either a cartoon or a picture with some text over it. And so for Ted and I, and I know Beth in the audience there, we're big on social media. We see this stuff all the time. And some of the stuff is good and funny, some of the stuff not so much. So we've got some memes to respond to today. The first meme here, I'll load it up on the screen. For those here in the live studio audience, you've been able to see what I do here on the computer when we got the show. So here's the first one I'm going to talk about. And it's a really popular one. There was a Facebook profile called The Friendly Atheist. It's a guy who runs a blog on Pathos. He's not very friendly. All right, he calls himself the Friendly Atheist, but really he's not. He put this up there, and this image here was shared over 75,000 times. All right, so there are 75,000 people on Facebook, and that's when I checked earlier in the week, that have shared this image. And it says, according to Genesis, we all come from Adam and Eve, who had 3 sons. Think about that. Take all the time you need, right? Okay, we see the point here. There's, they're saying, this is, there's incestuous relationships that occur there in the Bible, and that's where we come from. Oh no. So how do we respond? Well, there are 2 ways that we could respond, and it might even depend upon your perspective of the age of the earth. So I'll give what I take as the young earth creation defense first here, and it's that, well, the DNA, so when we have incestuous relationships today, the DNA is so corrupted that it just creates children that have deformities or whatnot. Things aren't going right. But early back then, the DNA was more pure, and so it was permissible, of course, because later on we see that it becomes prohibited having incestuous relationships in the Mosaic Law. So that they do get to a certain point where that's prohibited. So it's really okay. Now, there's a second model that I would say I'm more sympathetic to, that says, well, maybe Adam and Eve, and for some of you this might be a bit controversial, maybe they weren't the only creatures, and we might have different subcategories between this, but if you think that Adam and Eve were historical, maybe they weren't the only humans out there. After all, we read in terms of what happens to Cain from Cain and Abel, right? Cain goes off, and what does he do? How many people know? What does Cain do? He builds a city. Who's living in the city? You don't build a city when there are no people to live in it, right? That's just wasting his time. And if this is the beginning of the earth, you don't want to wait. You got to survive, right? So you don't want to build buildings no one's going to live in. Let the government do that. Build bridges to nowhere. So, if there's a city, there's people. So there's something maybe going on. In my perspective of the text, there's more going on behind the scenes here. And so it's not really a problem for me. This meme doesn't really harm my position at all. But let's think about this from the atheist perspective, the naturalistic perspective, I should say. Common descent, the theory of evolution. If that's the only way we got here, I think under common descent, you've got to have similar relationships in order for the species to continue on, at least when they first branch off. So I think that might still be a problem for the naturalist here as well. So it's really not an issue. I think when all things are considered, I think atheists they might have other motivations that are pushing them towards putting these things, which are causing inconsistencies. That's the problem. It's really the inconsistencies here. All right, so that's the first meme. We've got another one here too. Let me load it up for you. And it reads, "World's best archaeologist never does archaeology." Ted, tell me here, what do you think of this? This one's for you. World's best,
wow.
And it's, of course, your favorite character from fiction.
I don't know if I agree with that meme. No.
Indiana Jones, world's best archaeologist, never does archaeology. Well, does he do? I mean, maybe he does. He tries, at least.
Is that a real meme?
Yeah, it's on the internet, so that must
be real. It must be
yeah.
true.
Yeah, I didn't make it up just now. Yeah, if it's on the internet, it's real.
It's got to be real. It's got to be real. Yeah, well, in actuality, at least not in the 1940s when Indy was sort of doing his archaeology. It was sort of going on at the time, but there was a time in which archaeology, called the Antiquarian period, in which it was pretty much grave robbers, tomb raiders. But Indy does say that this needs to be in a museum. He would always, tell the person he was getting the artifact from, it needs to be in a museum. But yeah, I mean, he doesn't really do archaeology in the academic sense of the term.
Sure.
Yeah, he doesn't. He's not excavating, with a trowel, and he's not in a city doing.
But he is trying to find artifacts.
Stratigraphic archeology, yes, through different means.
That's the politically correct way of saying it.
Exactly. But in actual, to be in all honesty, there. In fact, this is a good point, a little segue to talk about something called non-provenanced artifacts. Big word. Explain what it means. Non-provenanced artifacts. These are artifacts that were taken out of context. The most important thing in archaeology is context. So, for instance, this little scarab here, I got this at a museum store. Okay, what if you found this in Egypt?
A real one?
It looked like this in Egypt near the pyramids with some other stuff. Any difference in that? One is in a store, the other one, that's called a provenance. So non-provenance means is that you have an artifact, but we don't really know where, we can't say definitively. Some things we know they're old, but we don't exactly know. We didn't find them in place or in situ, in place. There's actually a very famous archaeological discovery that's non-provenance. Actually lots of them. One you know about. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Did you know that?
Yeah.
That the original Dead Sea Scrolls were non-provenance. In other words, they were actually collected on an antiquities market. And
the black market.
The black market, right. Yes. And then they went later and they found more scrolls in the caves. But initially they were not. In fact, a lot of the antiquities that we find, we know they're ancient based on other types of things, but they're non-provenance. And so there's been a big problem even today. In fact, it's a big problem of people going into archaeological sites in Egypt and Israel, with ISIS going into Nineveh in Iraq, and they're looting these sites, and they're getting these rare historical artifacts and selling them on the black market. And these are non-provenance artifacts. So archaeology kind of is like Indiana Jones today in a sense that you really need somebody that's swashbuckling and not afraid of danger to go into some of these places and deal with some pretty shady characters.
Yeah.
To get some of these artifacts, to recover these artifacts.
And even still, it makes it hard, right? Because you're not sure. I mean, there could be forgeries and fakes, right?
Absolutely.
And that's the downside to not finding it in the ground.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So before the break, we talked about, one of the questions I asked you was if you thought there was stuff that was supposedly disproving the Bible. Let's go to the other end of the spectrum.
Okay.
Do you think that there is one amazing archaeological discovery which proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Christianity is true and really causes people to believe?
Is there one archaeological discovery that would prove beyond a shadow of a doubt the Bible's true and cause people to believe?
It's just so clearly obvious that what this discovery is that Christianity is true. Is there something like that?
I would be tempted to say, and again, we haven't talked about this, it is a non-provenance artifact because we don't know the original where it actually, we think we know, we can sort of conjecture, obviously, if it's true, the theory about it's true, and we know where it came from, but the historical trail sort of leaves off in about the 14th century, and that's the Shroud of Turin. The Shroud of Turin, of course, claims to be the burial cloth of Christ. And I was, as you mentioned earlier, I got the honor, the privilege of being on CNN. Well, not know if that's an honor, but being on CNN, the Communist News Network. I mean, cable news network.
We are live streaming here, Ted.
Oh, we are. That's right. We're not on CNN.
No, not on CNN.
This is the free internet.
But hey, if CNN wants to retweet this, you are welcome to do so.
They didn't pay me anything, so I can. But no. Yeah. So basically, the Shroud. Interestingly, when I got to be on CNN, I actually contacted someone that I trust, that I go to for my, what do you think about this? And a couple of them, one of them was, some of you may or may not know who he is, Dr. Gary Habermas from Liberty University. And I called Gary, I actually emailed him, told him I was going to be on CNN. We're going to be talking about the Shroud of Turin. I know Gary's done a lot of work on the Shroud. So Gary said, Ted, you need to contact a gentleman by the name of Jerry Bergeron, who is a forensic pathologist, not a pathologist, forensic. He does basically autopsies, forensic autopsies. And he has done some work on it. And then so I contacted him. He sent me some of his papers he's done on the Shroud. And that led me to another book I got on my Kindle iPad app, and I read on the plane on the way to New York to be filmed for the CNN interview. And it was a book by a gentleman by the name of Frederick Zugby, and it's called The Crucifixion of Jesus. It's the most definitive physiological account of the Shroud. Like they were based on cadavers, based on bodies. And so through talking to Gary, Dr. Habermas, and through talking to Jerry Bergeron and talking to others and reading the Zugby book, let me just summarize the Shroud here, the Shroud of Evidence, or the Shroud of Turin. The way Gary describes it is that we eliminate, we say what it's not. It's not this, it's not that, it's not that. So by process of elimination, you eliminate what it is. That leaves what it could be. So here's the one thing it's not. It's not a painting. It is not a painting. It is not, in fact, it is created by forces that we don't exactly fully understand. But what it appears to be, the best evidence now appears to be that there was intense radiation coming from the body on the Shroud. There's only two kinds of radiation that could form that type of that power of radiation: X-ray and gamma radiation. If you know anything about astronomy, a gamma ray burst is the most powerful supernova in the known universe, and they're so powerful that if one were to happen in our solar system, life would affect life on Earth.
And we haven't even been able to control X-rays or gamma rays for so long.
No. So here's the thing: physiologically, we know that patients who have been through chemotherapy, large amounts of radiation therapy. On their deathbed, there would be a print of a hand or something like that. But an entire body, like it's literally a photographic, the image on the shroud is a photographic negative. And it is an X-ray, or at least it looks like an X-ray. Upon infrared examination of the image in the shroud, there's actually, you can see the roots of the teeth through the beard. There are things that people in the 14th century, because the current theory about the shroud was that in the 14th century they painted it, relics were being spread around Europe and France and Germany and England, and so it was just a relic from then. But there were things physiologically and scientifically on the shroud that scientifically were unknown in the 14th century. And one of them, several amazing things, was that the thumbs were not, if you look at the shroud, the body is like this, the feet are together, the hands are crossed over the groin area, and that doesn't look like there are any thumbs. And it looks like the fingers are really, really long. That's because it's showing the bones going all the way up into the hand. It's like an X-ray. If you were to go take an X-ray of your hand, your fingers don't just stop there. The bones continue to go up. So the image on the shroud has the bones going all the way up, but there are no thumbs. It looks like the thumbs are gone. Well, now we know, based on work, they did this through cadavers, things like that a Roman nail would have went through the end of the wrist here. There is a medial tendon nerve. It's a tendon that attaches to the thumb. When a nail goes through that wrist there, it breaks or pops the tendon. The thumb retracts inside the hand. So whoever this person was on the shroud was crucified, and their thumbs went in. And they had intense incisions on their head. They had coins placed on their eyes. We know that was a practice that was done by the Jews in Second Temple Jerusalem, by the Pharisees. Who was Jesus buried? Whose tomb was he buried in? Joseph of Arimathea. Who was Joseph of Arimathea? He was a Pharisee. Pharisees had began to adopt practices by the Romans, and one of the things the Romans did was they placed coins over the eyes to pay the ferryman, because they believed, I don't know why they placed them with Jesus' eyes, but it was just a practice they did. The body was wrapped rapidly. They had dirt on the knees, dirt and particles on the feet. They've taken some of the particles through an electron microscope, and you can actually pinpoint it's limestone that was in the bottom of the feet. Limestone has a chemical composition and a chemical identifier that identifies exactly where the limestone came from. It came from Jerusalem in a quarry in the 1st century that was used as a burial area. So whoever this person was, we're not quite sure, but he walked in that area. He was crucified. He had severe blood loss. There was a blood and serum stain on the side, contusions on the knees. Oh, and on the back of the shroud image, there are lacerations from flailing from a flagrum, from a Roman flagrum. And the flagrum, actually, you can literally see this. It's called the cat o' nine tails, and so it's basically a stick with leather thongs on it. At the end of the leather thongs, there are lead barbells, little teeny barbells, and they would stretch the person around a column so that their skin was stretched tight, and they would slap the metal into the back and pull it down. It would just rip the skin off and blood go everywhere. The person in the shroud, on their buttocks, on their back of their legs, their whole back is covered with whipping marks from this cat of nine tails. Radiation, crucifixion, we don't know where it came from.
Yeah.
We eliminate all these things that it might not be, but I'll let you decide if you think it's real.
Yeah. Well,
it's pretty amazing.
All right, so that's.
But can I finish this?
Sure, yeah.
I'm sorry, I forgot one little key part of this. The original question was, what archaeological evidence would there be? What one thing would convince? And my answer would be nothing. Nothing will convince the person who doesn't want to believe. Why do I say that? And I opened up to this passage here when you start to ask a question. Luke chapter 16, beginning in verse 19. This is the story of the rich man and Lazarus. Remember the story of the rich man and Lazarus that Jesus told us? Parable or story really happened. The rich man went into torment, and the poor man, the beggar Lazarus, went to Abraham's bosom, which is where the Pharisees wanted to be because they loved Abraham. And this dialogue ensues between Abraham and the rich man who was in torment. And he said, if you will bring Lazarus back from the dead and go to my brothers and warn them of this horrible place, do not come here, so that they will believe. And what does Abraham tell Lazarus? They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. No, but he insists. But you don't understand. If you would send Lazarus back if he would rise from the dead and come back out of the grave, they would surely believe. And he says once again, they have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them. If they would not believe Moses and the prophets, they would not believe though one rise from the dead. That's exactly what he says. So you can have the most amazing amount of evidence, even a man rising from the dead, and those who do not want to believe will not believe, no matter what evidence you show them, because the issue is not the evidence, the issue is the heart. The issue is the will. I do not want to believe. I want to hang on to this. I want to hang on to that. I don't want to believe this stuff. Yep. I don't want it. So evidence is good, but it's not going to, as we say in the South, it ain't going to convince the skeptic. It's not. It just will not convince the hardened skeptic.
Yep. I know we're going to get a little bit more into other archaeological discoveries that have been made later today. So let me ask you this, since we're running short on time here. Are there any new discoveries that you are able to tell us a little bit today? Give us some inside scoop on that you wouldn't, give yourself a bad name for telling us common average Joes.
Yes, there's some interesting things out there. And again, let me preface my answer by saying this, that in archaeology, there are different phases of an excavation, different phases of research. And the very first phase, obviously, is the research itself. You read the books and you read the articles in the journals, things like that. And the biblical text or the historical text, whether it's the Iliad, the Odyssey, or the Bible or whatever. And then you read all the pertinent literature. And the first thing you do when you go to the field is you do what's called a survey. And a survey, you're just doing what a survey does. You're surveying the site. You're saying, okay, we find some arrowheads here, some pottery here, and some pottery there, and you mark it down, and you kind of sort of get an outline of where you're going to excavate. And then you go back and you excavate. So with that being said, there are a couple of things that are interesting. One in particular, and I hesitate to say this because I know it's going to sound really far-fetched what I'm about to tell you, but trust me, I know all the background story to this. There seems to be a site on Mount Ararat in Turkey at 13,000 feet. It's a wooden structure, and that's all I'm going to say.
Deep beneath the ice.
Deep beneath the ice. It's in a glacier. There have been, of course, the boy who cried wolf. There's been tons of people said, "Oh, we found it." But this is not going away. It came out in America several years ago, and it was broken by a team of Chinese Christians, and has since been sort of pushed under the rug. But behind the scenes, there are people up there investigating this site. So those who are skeptical, and I know that there are those, especially on the internet, who are going, "Yeah, right, whatever." But I'm with you, totally with you. But we're just in the site survey phase. So I'm not going to say what it is. I'm just saying it's at 13,000 feet.
There's this cool thing at 13,000 feet.
It's a big, giant wooden structure. It contains fossilized animal droppings. Not making that up. It contains wooden rooms. There are no nails.
Maybe it was a ski lodge.
It could have been a ski lodge. Could have been. It's broken in half. It has a very harsh smell. You have to have a respirator to be on in this thing. The smell has been likened to like a chemical smell, like ammonia. And we know when animals urinate on the ground and it becomes saturated in maybe wood, it will turn to ammonia. And so this is there's horrible smells emanating from this thing, whatever this artifact is.
The dog wasn't trained.
He wasn't trained, exactly. It could have been, I don't know, maybe a barn or something. Who knows?
Sure.
But we don't know for sure what it is. But it was reported that this was discovered. My skepticism came when I wanted to see the pictures, and I was a little skeptical of it. But when I began to, I've seen some photographic evidence and some video evidence of this particular structure. And I'll just say my initial thoughts as an archaeologist. We need to do further research on this, and it's being done. So one of the things I'm actually my hobby. I'm like, what I think is a good time, people would think is a horrible time. I'm a mountain climber. I've climbed Mount Rainier, Mount Shasta in California. Mount Rainier's in Seattle. Mount Rainier's, they're both 14,000-foot mountains. The summit of Mount Rainier is 14,411. The summit of Mount Shasta is 14,162. And you have to train really hard. You have to really be in excellent shape. to go climb on top of these things. Mount Ararat is about, I think it's 17,000, 15 or 17,000 feet. It's really tall. And so at 13,000 feet, you can barely breathe, much less try to create some type of giant structure under the ice. And furthermore, where it is, it's actually locked under a glacier, and the people who found it had to rappel down to get down inside of it. So that's all I'm going to say. Stay tuned. I'm not going to be sensational about it, but it's there. There's a wooden structure on Mount Ararat at 13,000 feet. That's what we know so far. It has animal droppings in it. It has some pottery in it. There are people up there researching it now. I was supposed to go a couple of years ago because the people that I'm in contact with they're actually connected with the mountain and with the people who found it. They knew I'm a mountain climber, and they invited me to go to a trip. I was going to fly to Istanbul. I had just gotten back from Norway, and they said, "Can you leave on Monday morning to go to Istanbul to climb Mount Ararat?" I'm like, I would love to do that, but I just can't right now. Like, there's no way. And I'm like, oh man, I wish I had a wealthy, I wish I knew some kind of wealthy person. But yeah, I was supposed to go up there, and we were going to do what's called 0-point surveying, which is it's what cave divers use. So it's basically a device, and when you go, those cave divers, when they're diving into a cave, they want to measure the cave. So it's a device with a laser that sends out a laser, and it measures the inside of the cave. So we're going to take this device inside this structure and measure the three-dimensional shape of the structure. There are rooms. I was told they were climbing down. I've talked one-on-one to people who have been on the structure. I've talked to them face-to-face, asked them questions, and there are large container rooms below deck. So there's big rooms, there's small rooms. The ladders are actually logs with stairs chopped into them, but there are no nails. There's wooden pegs, and it's got a black pitch type substance on the inside walls.
Does the structure look like that big thing down in Kentucky?
Actually, no, it does not. It absolutely does not. That's interesting. That's when you say that. And I have.
Gee, I wonder why.
I have. You set me up. I have friends that work for Answers in Genesis, and I love them. They're great men of God. If you're listening, love you guys. But what gets me about the Answer in Genesis Ark down in Kentucky is it's not when you look at the outside of it, it's not what the biblical. And what gets me is that my friends at Answer in Genesis, they really like to hold up the fact that they're staying with the text. But what the outside design, they didn't stay with the text. It's like this big giant boat-looking fin. That's not in the text. The text, it's basically a barge. It's a square. In fact, Henry Morris, one of the early young Earth creationists, he was actually a hydrologist. They did some studies done, some feasibility studies on Noah's Ark. They made a scale replica of Noah's Ark. It was a square box, like based on exactly the biblical. They did it to scale. They put it in a tank that was used by the U.S. Navy or something to test supertankers and ships. They said that the Ark could withstand a 200-foot tidal wave head on because it was so stable. It could just ride out. It could go up and down, but it would not.
All it needs to do is
would
float.
not turn over. It just needs to float.
Yeah.
And so this thing in Kentucky is like a boat. That's not what the biblical. That's not what.
You
the
mean
text,
Noah wasn't like navigating the waters?
There was no sails. There was no Evinrude outboard motor. No sails. No, it was just a barge. So cool. I mean, they do some great stuff, and it's an amazing exhibit. But you do get to see the scale of it. It's enormous, just to see how large it is.
Well, Ted, thanks for sharing that information with us. It's pretty sweet, and thanks for coming on the show again today.
Thank you for having me. It's had fun. Thank you.
Great. Well, that does it for the show today. I'm grateful for the continued support of our patrons. Those are folks that just chip in a couple bucks a month, $5 or $10. Wink, wink to the live audience. And to the partnerships that we have with our sponsors, Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, Rethinking Hell, the Illinois Family Institute, Evolution 2.0, and Traffic Buffet. Thank you to the tech team today, which is, that's me doing the one-man band today, and to our guest, Ted Wright. And thank you for listening in and for striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.